Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Making the Familiar Strange today, when we have Sharon Royers here to talk about the story of the two sisters. My name is Ali Zimmermoss, and I'm Tri-Faith's Curriculum and Volunteer Specialist. In this program, I'm here to welcome you, to remind you of how Making the Familiar Strange works, and to assist our special guests in whatever ways they prefer. Remember that the goals of this program are to take a look at Abrahamic stories together and to take on new perspectives by looking at familiar or sometimes less familiar stories with fresh eyes and with new points of view. Excuse me. Today, as I mentioned, we are very excited to welcome Sharon Royers of Countryside Community Church, who will share her perspective on the story of Jesus's visit to his friends Martha and Mary from the Gospel of Luke. But first, remember that our rules in this program are to be respectful, to reconsider what assumptions you might be bringing to this story, to speak from your own point of view rather than speaking on behalf of a larger group of people, so using I statements rather than we statements on behalf of a large group of people. And keep in mind that in looking at these nuanced stories, we're all trying to hear and consider a new perspective that might be different from our own, and it's totally fine if we don't agree with that new perspective. It's okay to have different perspectives on anything shared or not shared between different religions and worldviews. So next month, on July 12th, we'll have Abdul Maki, who I know is in here today and is probably a familiar face to a number of you. He'll be sharing his Muslim perspective on the prophets and messengers in the Quran. So that is sure to be a fun session. And that's July 12th, as I said. But for today, we will be hearing Sharon's perspective on this story from the New Testament. She's asked me to keep an eye on the chat for her, to let her know when you send any questions or comments in there. And she's let me know that she's very flexible, very interruptible, and open to organic conversations coming out of this discussion. So either when she opens things up for discussion or whenever you feel inspired, please feel free to participate in whatever way is most comfortable to you, whether that is through the chat or just unmuting yourself to chime in. And however you prefer to participate, please don't be afraid to get involved in the conversation. All perspectives are welcome, as you hopefully get the impression from some of these ground rules and things. So Sharon, thank you for joining us. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to you to introduce yourself and get us started.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy summer solstice. Good to see so many familiar faces. So let me start by sharing my screen here. There we go, and we'll get started. I'll talk a minute here. Oh, let's see if I can get it. There we go. Okay, so I'm not really sure why, when I was asked to present, why I chose this particular story, but it just came to me and I thought, well, okay, we'll go with it. And I had a lot of fun researching the Mary and Martha story and the two sisters. But before I get into my presentation too deep, I do want to clarify that I am not an expert by any means. And so I really had to research, which was part of the fun of this, do some research and learn about this myself. Now, I call myself a Goldilocks of religion, and I'm sharing this piece with you because I think it's important for you to know the lens from which I view the world and the Bible and this story. I am going to be presenting multiple perspectives, not just mine, but just real quick, for me, I was raised Missouri Synod Lutheran, which is the conservative arm of the Lutheran Church. I attended Lutheran schools from kindergarten through high school. And it was when I went away to public university that my eyes were open to the fact that the world was perhaps a little different than what I was taught. And specifically, I began to question what I was taught in my religion when I went away to Illinois State University, joined the women's rugby club, was one of 2 straight women on the team, and learned that gay people are actually very nice. They're not, they're good people. In fact, I thought they were probably kinder than most of the church people I grew up with. So that was my first crack in my beliefs that I was raised in as a child. And so I broke away from the Lutheran Church at that point, was kind of a nothing for a while. Then I tried born again Christian while I was in college. That was an interesting experience, kind of cult-like. And then later in life, as I became a parent, my husband and I raised our children in the United Methodist Church. And as that church had its issues, which I'm sure all of you know about, it's been in the news, we kind of broke away from that and we went Unitarian. So then we were Unitarian for a while, and enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of Unitarianism, but we felt it lacked the spirituality and we missed that. And then suddenly Countryside appeared on our radar when we learned that it was a Christian church that was considering joining the Tri-Faith Initiative. And that has led me to my home that I'm happy to be in right now, my church home at Countryside Community Church. So I share that little quick summary of my religious history, again, because it's important for you to know the lens from which I present information to you today. And as I said, I will be presenting multiple perspectives of the Mary and Martha story, which is found in Luke. And I'd like to begin by reading the story to you, just in case someone hasn't read it recently. So this is how Luke tells the story. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." So this is the story we're going to discuss. And as Allie had said earlier, at any time, if you want to jump in, I'm fine with that. We can wait till the end and do some discussion. I hope to have some deep discussion with you. I hope this is interactive. But I'm going to begin with my first perspective. I'm going to share a total of 5 different perspectives to this story with you. And the first is from my childhood, as I've already said, Missouri Synod Lutheran, which is, I would categorize perhaps as a fundamentalist church, believes in the literal interpretation of the scripture. And you'll note that my picture of Jesus that I have displayed with this perspective is quite white, because my memory of all my theology and religion books and Sunday school lessons and school lessons, Jesus was always very, very white. So was Adam and Eve and everybody else in the Bible, blonde-haired and blue-eyed a lot of the times. So, but what I remember of this story, and I don't mean to oversimplify, but I am sort of doing that for dramatic effect, that Mary was the good one in the story, that she prioritized worshiping Jesus. And I underline the word worshiping because I was not taught that Mary was at the feet of Jesus to learn. That I was not taught that. I was taught that she was there to worship the Lord. And that was the focus that we should all have, worshiping Jesus, not necessarily listening to the teachings of Jesus. And that Martha was, now, of course, I'm using the word bad, please forgive me. Again, this is me being a little dramatic in my presentation, but that she was wrong. And I even remember being taught that Jesus reprimanded Martha, right? Reprimanded, kind of yelled at her because she was focusing on the wrong thing. So this is my memory of what I was taught for this Bible story. And again, you know, attending Lutheran schools, it wasn't just Sunday school. We did daily religious lessons. So we heard this story multiple times. And so again, the takeaway that I learned as a child was that we should be worshiping Jesus above all else. So perspective 2, when I landed on this story to present on, I thought this is going to be kind of fun, but I really do want to learn other perspectives. And so I did a Google search and I came up with this book called Mary, Martha, and Me, Seeking the One Thing That Is Needful. And I thought, oh, this is just perfect. I will learn so much and this will really help my presentation. And I ordered the book, I got the book, I started reading the book. And the author's describing a very sweet relationship with her grandmother and how she reveres her grandmother. Her grandmother was a very, very talented quilter and excellent at all the skills, the domestic skills that were required. And then the author starts talking about the Relief Society. And I'm naive, I suppose. Maybe some of you have heard of the Relief Society. I had not, so I had to Google, what is she talking about? What's the Relief Society? It is basically a women's organization within the Mormon Church. And within that religion, and I in no way mean to speak for anybody from the Mormon Church, because obviously I know little, but I just thought this was an interesting perspective from this book on Mary and Martha. And essentially it was the reverse of what I was taught, that Mary was the bad one. She should have stayed in her lane and helped her sister and do the domestic duties. And Martha was the good one. She focused on her domestic duties, as was her place. And I'm going to actually take a second, if you don't mind, to read a couple of excerpts from this book to give you an illustration of the perspective that I summarized so simply here. Because again, it's a whole book. But to give you an idea, the author is talking about her grandmother, and she says, Grandma was not a Mary. I could never remember seeing Grandma read a book or hearing her talk about things she learned from books, least of all the scriptures. She married young and began her family immediately without another thought of formal study. Once I started college, she was interested in how often I dated, not what I was learning in school or from the gospel. She was concerned that I not neglect the boys along the way and get so smart that no man would want to marry me. No, Grandma was not a Mary. So you get the idea. I've got one more perspective from this book. Yeah, it was kind of a wow. I thought, wow, this was not what I was expecting when I ordered this book. So again, she's talking about Mary and Martha. And she says, over the years, many have criticized Martha for her attention to duty and mismanaged priorities. Knowing Grandma and others like her, I believe Martha would have been hurt and surprised at such criticism. On the contrary, she would have expected praise from us and especially from Jesus. After all, her much serving was for him, to show him the depth of her family's respect. In her own way, she wanted to repay him for his abundance toward them. Out of this sense of gratitude in Martha and Mary's minds, no service could appear too much, no gift excessive. So again, another perspective on the story. And it's important to think about the lens from which each person views the story or hears the story. So that was perspective number 2. Perspective number 3 is really common. I found it in multiple readings. This idea of contemplation versus action. And you may even have heard people say something, are you a Mary or a Martha? The idea that Mary and Martha are archetypes of Christianity, the doing versus being, service versus prayer, outward versus inward journey. And one author actually pointed out that Luke sandwiched this story of Jesus visiting Mary and Martha in Bethany between the parable of the Good Samaritan, which tells us how to act, how to treat our neighbor, and the story of the Lord's Prayer, which is an example of how to pray or be contemplative. And that particular author was suggesting this was intentional, that it was Luke's intention to share this story between those two to illustrate that both are needed in a faithful life, that we need both to be able to look inward, know how to pray, how to connect with the Creator. At the same time, if we spend all our time inward, we're missing something, we're out of balance. And so being and putting our faith in action is also important, according to many. This is their idea of why this story was even told by Luke. That balance of both taking action with our faith and spending time, hopefully you like my little cartoon from Hagar the Horrible, spending time on the mountaintop, just contemplating and connecting with Spirit. And sometimes we can get lost and out of balance and be so busy in service that we forget to stop and connect with the Spirit that moves us to serve. And sometimes we can spend a little too much time on our meditation mats because it's safe and peaceful there, and forget the art of service and that we're called to serve. So that again is a third perspective. Now this next perspective, I must admit, is my favorite. This is perspective 4. Jesus was a feminist, and this story was shared as a Feminist Manifesto, that Jesus is defending Mary's right to study with him, not worship at his feet, to study and learn with him. We have to remember back in the day, Jesus was a rabbi, and women didn't study and learn with the rabbis. Men did, generally speaking. And so this was out of the societal norm and Jesus was encouraging Mary to do that, to study and learn with him. So was Jesus expanding gender roles of his day in this story? And is that why Luke chose to share it? Was Jesus really reprimanding Martha, as I was taught as a child, or was he trying to set her free from her default mode of operation, society's choice for her? Society's choice was for her to take care of the needs of everybody, the household, the cooking, the cleaning, do all that. Was Jesus, instead of reprimanding Martha, was he trying to free her? Another point that was made is that, and this was by an author, and I put my reference down at the bottom of this slide for you, the Women's Bible Commentary. And this book is found in the Countryside Library. That's where I borrowed it, and it'll be back after today, so you can borrow it if you like. But a point the author made was that Luke describes Mary listening passively to Jesus, but the disciples and even Jesus himself engaged in discussions and asked questions when they were learning. It was very interactive and engaging. And so my question is, did Luke miss something? And when I read this, I thought, we have to remember that Luke was a male of his day, writing this story many, many years after it occurred. And I would like to imagine that Mary at Jesus' feet was actually asking him questions. Teacher, what do you think of this? Teacher, tell me about this. And questioning, and that Jesus would have been incredibly welcoming to that questioning. That's how I imagine it. And I think the idea of Mary just sitting, listening passively would be from a male perspective of how that story was, perhaps. But I love this perspective. It's my second favorite. The one I'm about to share with you is even more my favorite. But this is my second favorite, not just because I'm a feminist and I love the idea, oh, Jesus is a feminist, what a great shirt, I want to order that. But we as Christians believe that Jesus' purpose was to set us free, was to set us free. Now, in a very conservative, fundamentalist version of that, it's to set us free from our sins and death. But in a more progressive version of set us free from whatever is oppressing us. And sometimes that's societal's dictates to us of what our role is, depending on whether we're women, men, or whatever in between. What society dictates who we should be oftentimes is oppressive. And if you really pay attention to the teachings of Jesus, he was about setting the oppressed free. And so that's one of the reasons I really love this perspective, because it fits with what I believe about Jesus, that he would want to set both women, Mary and Martha, free to be who they are without societal norms getting in the way. So the fifth perspective that I came across, Richard Rohr, if you're not familiar, if you're a member of Countryside, you're probably familiar with Richard Rohr. He's one of our favorite authors. Many of our journey groups study his books. He is a Franciscan monk, priest, who started an organization in New Mexico called the Center for Contemplation, the Center for Action and Contemplation, actually. But he sends out daily meditations. You can get on his email list. And as I was looking at the different perspectives of this story, I thought to myself, I would love to know Richard Rohr's perspective. It's going to be good. And so I just Googled Richard Rohr, Mary and Martha, and up came his daily meditation from November of 2017. And you can Google this and you'll find the full meditation. He called it the one thing. And so what I've done is I've shared a few of the most important quotes from it because it's kind of lengthy. First of all, hold on one second because my screen is covering my words. There we go. Martha was everything good and right, but one thing she was not. She was not present, most likely not present to herself or her need to be needed. Richard Rohr goes on to continue to say, how you are present to anything is how you can be present to God. And I'm going to read that one again because I think that's the most important sentence from what he shares. How you are present to anything is how you can be present to God. For Martha and for us, such naked presence was indeed the one thing necessary. If you are present, you will be able to know what you need to know. These are the seers. Truly seeing is both simple and that hard. And you may need to take a minute to take this in because it's pretty deep, and that's typical Richard Rohr. But basically, my take on what he's saying is the issue where Martha went wrong, if you will, and probably wrong is too strong of a word, or was that she wasn't being fully present. Mary sat down, was still, and was ready to be fully present in the moment. And Martha was whirling and twirling about, taking care of what needed to be taken care of. And so this idea of presence and being present in the moment, I love that he points out, and the way I interpret it is, we can't be fully present with God if we don't know how to be fully present in the moment. Can we be really present with the Creator if we don't know how to be still and be present with this very moment we're in right now? And that's how I interpreted what he was saying. I have a morning routine, if you will, that involves a few things. One of them being reading something that I find inspiring and helps me connect to the Creator, the Spirit. And this book is actually entitled The Buddhist Path to Simplicity, Spiritual Practice for Everyday Life. So it is not necessarily a Christian text. It is actually written by a Buddhist, Christina Feldman, a female. And I want to read just a paragraph from it because I think that it helps explain what Richard Rohr is getting at with this idea of presence. The cultivation of mindfulness teaches us to engage fully with the moment we are in. We pay the price of fragmentation in stress, disconnection, and depression. Learning to treasure each moment, we learn to live in a sacred way, honoring each single moment. Bowing is a frequently cultivated ritual in Zen tradition. Students bow to the teacher, to each other, to their food, and to their meditation cushion. Mindfulness is a symbolic bow to each moment, reminding us not to stand outside our lives, but within them. Each time we bow to life, we dissolve separation and discover the peace of oneness. Now, again, this is a Buddhist text. So as a Christian, I read, each time we bow to life, we dissolve separation and discover the peace of the divine. That's kind of how I read it when they say oneness. I, in my mind, put in the creator spirit, the divine. So hopefully that helped a little bit explain at least my interpretation of Richard Rohr's interpretation of the story of Mary and Martha. So those were the 5 perspectives I wanted to lay out there for you. What I feel about this is the gift of this story and biblical stories in general. All stories, really, our own personal stories. There's always multiple viewpoints. And I've learned to come to love, to embrace the mystery. After spending my childhood, the beginning of my life, in a religion where I was taught that there was only one way to believe something and one way to see something. This idea of just not knowing necessarily, just embracing that mystery is very freeing. It's very, very freeing, and I love that. And I love imagining the possibilities when I hear these Bible stories, like my imagining of Mary at the feet of Jesus, not worshiping him, but asking him questions and learning from him, and stepping outside of her societal norms that were put upon her of that day. So that's basically the 5 perspectives I have for you on the story. I do have a few discussion questions. We don't have to discuss these. I can entertain your questions however you want to do it. But one question I have is, and I know we have at least one ordained minister in the audience who I would love to help answer this. Why does the story only appear in the Gospel of Luke and not the others? So I don't know if anybody wants to try to answer that or has an answer for that. That would be great.
The synoptic, the synoptic Gospels. Oh, first of all, I was Catholic, Roman Catholic all my life. Tremendous pain and scandal hit the Catholic Church, and it kind of washed me out. But I still believed in Christ, in the risen Christ. So that's how I ended up at St. Thomas. So with one of the Bible studies that I've done over the years looked at the synoptic Gospels, which are Mark and Luke and Matthew, versus the more kind of mystical Gospel of John. And the synoptic Gospels were drawn from this mysterious source called Q. And it may be that this story did not appear in Q, such that they felt comfortable popping it in, to the other. But it's a wonderful story, and I'm grateful for it, that it is in Luke.
Thank you, Mary, for that. Does anyone else want to chime in on the why? It's really a very short little story. We read it together. It's a teeny tiny little paragraph in Luke, but it's one we teach in our Sunday schools. It's a story that's shared widely across the denominations of the Christian faith. But I'm curious as to why it only appears in Luke, or perhaps the question could also be, why did Luke choose to share it? Which is another way to say it also. Why did Luke choose to share this story? What was his purpose in sharing it? Anyone have an idea on that?
Hi, this is Carrie Pillen. I'm trying to remember, Luke was written for people who had been Jewish before, right?
I would not be the expert to answer that question. Carrie, if you're still talking, you muted yourself.
No, so I didn't have more to say. That's why I muted myself, because, you know, sometimes that has a big effect on what gets put into the different Gospels, you know. I think actually it was Matthew who was writing for a primarily Jewish community. Certainly John was writing for people who were not former Jews to a large extent. And I was just muddling in my mind, you know, how that would tie into the choice for it to be in Luke, other than he's, you know, kind of known to be a really pastoral guy who really cares about the general people, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Sharon,
yes.
Carrie is right that the Gospels are written for different audiences. I never remember which one is which one. I should, but I don't. So I have to look it up every time. But I think she's right. Matthew was written for the Jewish audience. One is written for, now the words are going to escape me again. Anyway,
Gentiles.
for different audiences. Mm-hmm. And just as we all come with different and looking through a different lens, so with these people. But I could not say why one went one place and others went the other. In my little good news, New Revised Standard Version here, there is a segment just before the New Testament comes that shows which stories are in which Gospels, the Synoptics and John. And there are lots of blank spaces, you know, next to a story that says it's only in this one, but not in these other three.
That one, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have heard that, if I could.
Go ahead, Jeanette.
Okay. I have heard, and I don't know if it's accurate, that some people believe that Luke got part of his story from Mary, and that that might affect what was, you know, what was put into it.
Interesting. Yeah, I had not come across any of that in what I read and researched, but yeah, that is interesting. If this was Mary relaying the story to Luke, interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's accurate.
Sure. You know, one of the authors that I've read in describing this talked about the idea that, so when Martha is saying to Jesus, you know, hey, my sister's not helping and she should be, tell her to help me. Just kind of that dialogue with Jesus was an indicator of their relationship with Jesus. They were close friends. She felt comfortable saying something like that to Jesus, where others may not have talked to the teacher, the rabbi, that way, so directly. So it was, so was that Luke's point, just showing that Jesus had this friendship with Mary, Martha, and of course their brother Lazarus, that they were good friends. You know, I don't know. So, and then that leads to let's go to my second discussion question.
Before you head to your second discussion question,
yeah, sure.
Abdul has his hand raised.
Oh, thanks, Allie. Great presentation so far. I'm learning a lot. So who are Mary and Martha, in this story, and what significance, are they?
Oh, that's a really great question.
Non-Christians, so,
Sure, that is a great question, and I obviously made a lot of assumptions just jumping right into the story. So I appreciate the question, Abdul. And anybody else who wants to help answer it, that would be great. Again, I am no Bible scholar. But Mary and Martha, they were the sisters of Lazarus. And Lazarus, a common Bible story is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. They lived in Bethany, which was just outside Jerusalem, in the general area where Jesus did a lot of his teaching. So I think a lot of Bible scholars assume he was very good friends with the family, and he actually spent a lot of time in their home. It was a place for him to come and rest, have a meal, that kind of thing. So this one description of him in their home is not the only time he was in their home. Most Bible scholars believe he was good friends with them and that he spent a great deal of time in their home. So now the significance of it, the friendship with Jesus is one. And then again, it's the raising Lazarus from the dead story. So Judy or anyone else want to jump in and help? I feel very incompetent in describing these.
No, it's fine.
No, it's a great question, but I'm, again, not a Bible scholar.
And I will jump in to say, I'm sorry, I was just going to say that it's one of the few times in the Christian Bible that women even get mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
And Luke in general is so good. He's my favorite evangelist, favorite gospel, because he sprinkles his whole gospel with these little references to the women who listened to Jesus and then they followed him. And he just makes mention of women here and there in very wonderful ways. And so it's a very engaging gospel for women, I think, to read and to enjoy.
I think it would be interesting. I don't remember whether the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead came before this or after it, but it might be very interesting in terms of Mary sitting at the feet of Christ, if it were before or after.
That's a good point. For some reason, I think it's after. So anybody who's good at this, correct me if I'm wrong.
I think this story is before, because they're kind of wonderful bookend stories. There's another story where Martha actually kind of rises up as a witness to Jesus and his mission. And that happens right. She says, like, Jesus, why didn't you come when we told you knew that our brother Lazarus was dying? And Jesus, for some peculiar reason, did take his time. He kind of drug his heels, came in back to Bethany. Lazarus was dead. And Martha, being Martha, was able to kind of confront him with that. And then he wept. That was that little tiny 2-word, phrase, which is so striking. When Jesus went in to see Lazarus, Jesus wept. And yet when I've heard that story proclaimed, and then we talk about it in our faith communities, that's Martha rising up as a kind of, her heart, her faith was so strong. She says, Lord, I believe that even now you can raise my brother.
Thank you for that, Mary. Yeah, I think that's an important point in the answering of Abdul's question. The significance of Mary and Martha is that women aren't mentioned a whole lot in the Bible. And so for Luke to share this story, again, it's just a tiny story that's wedged between the Good Samaritan and the Lord's Prayer. But for him to wedge that in there, it's important. And maybe, so was that important to Luke? I'll kind of put the question back out there. Do you think it was important to Luke because it was including women in the story and a significant part of the story?
Hey, it's Carrie again, and I had not noticed or remembered that it was right after the Good Samaritan story. So of course, twice in a row, Jesus is paying great attention to people who are normally cast aside or not paid as much attention to. So that's very cool that it comes right after the Good Samaritan story.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as I mentioned, my evolution of viewing this story from the literal interpretation and we should be worshiping Jesus and knowing what our focus is versus this is about Jesus freeing women from their own, the societal roles, but perhaps for women too, and many of you know what I mean. We put ourselves in our own cages sometimes, don't we? And I really think that that is what Jesus is about. His message is about freeing us from the cages we put ourselves in, be it a seed that's planted with society and we take off with it, but you know, sometimes we can be our own worst enemies. And so if I were to describe this story today after my research and where I'm at spiritually now, I definitely think that this was about Jesus elevating women, allowing them the freedom to be who they are and not to lock themselves into the roles that they put on themselves and society puts on them. And so that's kind of that and I love Richard Rohr's The Importance of Being Present. The importance of being present. I love that perspective on the story as well. And that notion that if we can't be present in order to be present with God, we have to hone that skill of being present in the moment. And that is how we can connect with the divine and the importance of that. So can we shift gears for just a minute and go deep into this and talk about that idea of being in the moment? And because that's something that isn't just Christian, that's something that's across all religions, I would assume. So perhaps some can speak from their religious perspective, this idea of being present with the holy and being present in the moment.
I can with Islam, we do it 5 times a day.
Right.
So we got, yeah. I mean, it's just, you know, one-on-one, you know, in the presence, you know, of, you know, our Creator, you know, glorifying Him, and, you know, 5 times that throughout the day. So yeah, it's, you know, powerful and meaningful when it's, you know, just, you know, you and the Lord right there. So the world stops like around you. So, yeah.
And I can't speak for Abdul, but for myself, the more that I intentionally spend that time, the better I am at using it. And I learn to listen more than to talk. It's important. But I'm going to put a but in here just because I wish either Jesus or the interpreter had used a better term than better. I feel like Jesus was saying to Mary and to Martha that was the better choice for Mary at that time, in that moment. Maybe being in the kitchen is a better choice for Martha in that time, in that moment. But Martha doesn't need to impose what's good for her on Mary, and Mary doesn't need to impose on Martha what's good for her at any given time, which I think is kind of what we're about in our tri-faith, is doing what our faith helps us do with the people our faith helps us do it with. It's not about comparison. It's about finding what's authentic for you with your God? What's it? It's about finding out what's authentic for me with my God, with God.
I like that. I like that a lot. It's if I'm at my childcare job and a child is crying, I need to hold that child. That's a physical act. And I can't turn away, I can't turn away and be all quiet and meditative, but I can bring a sense of of the holy into that moment with the child. It's interesting. I'm getting better at that, giving myself a kind of permission to, and even that it's necessary to bring calm into that situation. And somehow there's chaos and calm kind of all going on together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that perspective, Judy. Thank you for sharing that. That idea that what's right for Mary isn't necessarily right for Martha, and what's right for Martha isn't necessarily right for Mary in that moment. And that really requires a lot of compassion for others to understand that, right? Very often we can easily fall into judgment of how people, and essentially that's what Martha was doing, the way the story's told. She's judging her sister, right? She should be helping me. It's much easier to fall into judgment of what people are doing and saying versus giving that compassion of they're doing what's right for them in the moment, whether I think it's right or not.
I have a question. I'm not sure I can articulate it, but is Mary in being present to the people in what she's doing, and then there's being present to God, and so where does that come in? That the present to people and the present to God, like in childcare, when you have a child crying, you are you're being present to that child. And I believe that that's something God wants you to do. So is that being present to God, or is that being present to child? Are you? I'm not sure I can articulate what I'm talking about, but I raise that as a question.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I hope others have an answer. I can tell you what my response to that would be is I personally believe that the divine is in all of us. The divine is in all of us. And so the divine is in that crying child. And so when Mary is attending to a crying child in the childcare center, she most definitely is attending to God. So that would be my response to that.
And I would say that Jesus said, when you do this to the least of these, you do it to me.
But we get back to Mary has chosen the better part. So I agree. That word, there's a yeah, right.
I'm not a linguist, so I can't interpret that any different for you.
Right.
Yeah.
And it may not be the word. I mean, it's a translation anyway. So yeah.
Exactly. I would love to hear other possibilities of that word as well. Something we should all research. We'll just research that. But yeah, I would love to know other interpretations of that word because it has a lot of weight. It's a judgment word. It's a judgment call.
Yeah.
So, and it seems a little uncharacteristic of Jesus in a way. So I just feel like, yeah, something got lost in translation with that word.
I wanted to make a comment about that. The first thing that struck me with this is it's a story, and these are sisters. So there's a relationship between the two of them. And the story, what it's telling me is it's like two sides of myself. It isn't, and we've kind of alluded to that in a little bit here too. But I think partly having them be sisters throughout the as part of the story is that it tells us something that we're related to both sides of those things. And yeah, that just really struck me because I certainly can be in both ways. I can be on my road and I mean, on my duties, and I can also be just in presence. Hopefully I can.
And I see that Carrie put in the chat, I actually think better is a good choice. Carrie, did you want to get in on this?
Well, I don't know. In some ways, better seems less judgmental to me. And again, it could mean better for her versus better for you. I just think sometimes the more general a word, the more interpretation allowed to be put into a word, the richer that it is.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carrie. I agree with you that the more the reader is allowed to bring themselves to the story and interpret, the better. So yeah, I would agree with that point for sure. Okay.
That doesn't mean I don't see value in the other person's point. I just say, for me, I like it.
There's a source that I've read occasionally, Mike Lawler, who's has been a Mediterranean biblical scholar and does know like a ton of languages. And over the years, he's tried to illuminate Christian, because he's a Catholic writer, very well researched. And so he's trying to broaden the way that we as Christians read and pray with the Bible to understand the Mediterranean culture that Jesus came from. And so he took great pains in one of his books to write all the ways in which it's kind of like there's an honor shame culture going on, men and women, there's these dyads going on a lot, and the interplay between and among different elements. And so I love the idea that Jesus was a feminist kind of thing and then flipping things. But I also know that there was just a struggle, I think, for men perhaps of the time to kind of flip things so that women did have that opportunity, that women have their own relationship with the divine. And I think that's just been going on ever since there have been men and women. But I was wondering if Abdul might have some thoughts about Mediterranean culture and ancient culture, and how that might have influenced Jesus and his followers. And how that maybe comes up a little bit in your own, ancient religion in terms of the outward versus the inner, like women being more the inner facing, men facing outward. That's kind of what Lawler was all about.
Wow.
Or not. We can kind of think about it until
give them a chance.
Okay, because Mediterranean culture is not homogeneous.
It's not homogeneous, yeah.
It's not homogeneous. It's definitely not. In speaking of the times, I am not Christian, but when Jesus, peace be upon him, went to the house, he felt comfortable, right? He felt comfortable. One of the sisters, acted like a Middle Easterner who said, hey, tell her, that she has to help me, right? Because, that's, typical, right? But again, the culture, like at the time, I mean, that depends. Islam came to, settle the score between, the biases, that women in traditional, Arab, pagan society at that time, which was, totally, you know, unjust, right? You know, they weren't allowed to do, you know, anything except, you know, procreate and cook, like no inheritance, you know, no voting, no ownership of land, you know, no rights or freedoms. So, you know, then again, and, you know, that culture was in Arabia, you know, almost like 1,000 miles away from, you know, Palestine or Judea or Samaria at the time. Okay. So I try to give an answer, Mary. So I hope that was okay. But yeah.
Yeah, just an idea of how, you know, we with our modernized see things, you know, the way we do. And I sometimes I just want to remember, you know, remember and see things as women of the time would see them best, you know, best we can.
Yeah, or men at the time too.
Or men at the time, yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I see that it's 12:58. Sharon, any last thoughts from you before we wrap up?
I really appreciate the discussion. You know, I had planned to not speak the whole time at all, just to lay some perspectives out there and spark discussion, and that's what occurred. And I really appreciate your participation and the discussion. And again, I think we all can agree, whatever our religion, the gift of story and being able to discuss the perspectives and bring ourselves to the story and the discussion is alone, you know, just an amazing blessing. So yeah, and the freedom to be able to have those discussions, that's not something any of us should take for granted. So yes, absolutely. So I appreciate all of you for participating. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Sharon, for your thoughtful preparation, for your discussion leadership, for researching and presenting 5 different perspectives. I think it was fun to hear your own story infused in that as well. So thank you for making the familiar strange. And I hope that all of the attendees here enjoyed this conversation. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.